She was the most powerful woman in the world. Portraits show her draped in pearls, skin porcelain white, eyes sharp enough to stare down the King of Spain. That image was a lie. Underneath the ruff and the jewels, Elizabeth Tudor was falling apart. Her teeth were black stumps. Her skin was cratered with scars she had spent decades burying under layers of paint that were slowly eating through her flesh. The question of what killed Queen Elizabeth I seems simple enough. She was 69. She died in 1603. Old age, end of story. But the real answer is far more disturbing and far more disgusting than any royal portrait would ever let on. So let us peel back the paint, sometimes literally, and find out what was really rotting the most famous queen in English history from the inside out. The White Mask. For the last 3 decades of her life, Elizabeth coated her face every single morning in a substance called Venetian ceruse. It was the foundation of the Tudor era, the closest thing 16th century England had to concealer, and it was made from 2 ingredients that no modern dermatologist would let anywhere near your skin: white lead and vinegar. Ladies of the bedchamber mixed the paste fresh each day and smoothed it in careful layers across the queen's face, her neck, and her chest. The finished effect was remarkable. Ceruse dried into a luminous, almost porcelain surface that glowed beautifully in candlelight and looked absolutely regal from across a reception hall. Up close, over time, the reality was something else entirely. Lead is a cumulative poison. Unlike something you eat that passes through your digestive system and leaves, lead lodges permanently in the bones, the blood, and the soft tissue of the organs. Every fresh application added to the total toxic burden already stored inside the body. It never left. It just accumulated, week after week, year after year, decade after decade. Chronic lead exposure produces a cascade of symptoms that Tudor physicians had no framework to explain. First come the severe abdominal cramps, which doctors of the period called the dry bellyache because they could not connect the stomach pain to the cosmetic on the patient's face. Then come muscle weakness in the extremities, memory lapses, dramatic and unpredictable mood swings, trembling hands, and a growing mental fog. Eventually, the kidneys begin to fail. Elizabeth applied this toxic mixture to her skin almost daily for approximately 30 years. That works out to somewhere in the range of 10,000 individual applications of lead paint directly onto living tissue, soaking through the pores and into the bloodstream below. The cosmetic that made her look immortal was quietly killing her one morning at a time. And the truly wretched part is that she could not have stopped even if someone had warned her. The ceruse was covering something underneath that was even harder to look at than the damage the lead was doing. And Elizabeth was not the only one wearing it. Ceruse was fashionable across the English court and across Europe. Wealthy women in Venice, Paris, and Madrid slathered it on daily. The difference was that most of them did not do it for 30 consecutive years, and none of them had an entire kingdom's stability resting on the smoothness of their complexion. The scars underneath. In October 1562, Elizabeth nearly died of smallpox at Hampton Court Palace. She was 29 years old and at the peak of her political authority when the virus struck. For days, her temperature soared, red pustules erupted across her body, and the Privy Council genuinely debated who would succeed her because they expected her to be dead before the week was out. She pulled through barely, but by most contemporary accounts, the pox appears to have left deep, pitted scars across her face, the kind of cratered, uneven damage that no amount of time or treatment would ever smooth over. In the 16th century, a queen's face was political currency. Foreign marriage negotiations, public processions through London, the portraits that were copied and distributed across Europe as diplomatic propaganda, all of it rested partly on how the monarch appeared. A scarred queen was a vulnerable queen. Elizabeth's answer was the ceruse mask, applied thick enough to fill the craters, smooth the surface, and restore the illusion of flawless skin from any reasonable distance. It worked in public. In private, the picture was very different. Courtiers who glimpsed her without the mask described skin that looked ravaged, discolored, and increasingly fragile, as though the paint and the scarring together had left something that barely resembled a face at all. So, a vicious cycle locked into place and never released its grip. The smallpox, or at least the belief that it had disfigured her, drove her to lead paint. The lead paint corroded and inflamed what was left of the natural skin underneath, making her more dependent on the next coat, which caused more damage, which required yet another coat. Each layer was simultaneously the treatment and the disease. It was a feedback loop with no exit except the grave, and Elizabeth rode it all the way down for 3 decades. The woman the public saw, gleaming and ageless at court ceremonies, bore no resemblance to the woman her closest attendants saw every evening when the paint came off. Those attendants knew the truth. They mixed the ceruse every morning and peeled it away every night, and they watched the face underneath deteriorate year by year. None of them could have told her to stop. You did not tell the Queen of England to stop doing anything. The black teeth. Elizabeth loved sugar with a devotion that bordered on compulsion, and the evidence was written all over her mouth. Multiple foreign ambassadors recorded her sugar habit in official dispatches to their home governments, apparently unable to resist mentioning the state of the English Queen's teeth while they were reporting on affairs of state. In 1598, a German traveler named Paul Hentzner visited the English court and wrote that the Queen's teeth were black, a defect the English seemed subject to from their too great use of sugar. He was being generous. By the final decade of her reign, Elizabeth had lost so many teeth that foreign visitors sometimes struggled to understand her speech entirely. Her remaining teeth were discolored stubs wedged into swollen, bleeding gums. The French ambassador André Hureau de Metz, who had an audience with her in 1597, recorded that her teeth were very yellow and unequal, with many of them missing, so that one could not understand her easily when she spoke quickly. It was a politely devastating observation buried inside an official diplomatic report. Sugar had once been a luxury reserved for the wealthiest households in England, imported at enormous cost and used sparingly. But by Elizabeth's time, cane sugar was flooding in from plantations in the Caribbean and the Atlantic Islands, and the price had dropped enough that the court consumed it in staggering quantities. The Queen ate candied fruits, marzipan sculptures, sugar plate ornaments that were originally designed as table decorations, but which she devoured regardless. Marchpane, gingerbread, and preserved quinces drowning in thick syrup. By the 1590s, her mouth was a landscape of rotting stumps, exposed roots, and inflamed gums that bled when she ate. Now here is where the sugar habit connects directly to the question of what killed her. Dental abscesses in the 16th century were not the kind of problem you solved with a course of antibiotics and a follow-up appointment. There were no antibiotics. There were no sterile dental tools. There was no understanding of bacteria. An infected tooth could, and routinely did, develop into full sepsis, the kind where bacteria from a rotting molar entered the bloodstream and traveled to the heart, the brain, the kidneys, the liver. Elizabeth suffered multiple severe dental infections in her later years, episodes so painful they left the entire side of her face swollen and throbbing for weeks at a time. At least once, the agony became so unbearable that the Bishop of London personally volunteered to have one of his own healthy teeth extracted right there in the chamber, in front of the Queen, to prove that the procedure could be survived before she would consent to let a barber surgeon anywhere near her mouth. That is how terrified she was of Tudor dentistry, and how advanced the infections had become that she seriously considered it. Each abscess was a roll of the dice with blood poisoning. Elizabeth rolled those dice over and over for the last 30 years of her life. The mercury treatment. Lead was not the only toxic metal that made regular contact with the queen's body. When the ceruse eventually irritated her facial skin into rashes, raw patches, and open weeping sores, the treatment prescribed by her court physicians was sublimate of mercury. Mercury was Tudor England's wonder drug, the 16th century equivalent of a miracle cure that doctors threw at every condition they could not otherwise explain. They rubbed it on syphilis lesions. They mixed it into plasters for skin complaints. They dissolved it into tonics for ailments ranging from constipation to melancholy. For the queen, mercury sublimate was applied directly to her damaged face as a kind of crude chemical peel. It stripped away the top layer of destroyed skin, which sounds almost like a modern dermatological procedure until you remember that the follow-up step was another thick coat of lead ceruse painted directly onto the freshly raw, stinging, exposed tissue underneath. Mercury and lead, applied in alternation to the same patch of skin year after year. Chronic mercury poisoning produces a well-documented cluster of symptoms that would have been impossible for Tudor medicine to connect back to the treatment. Fine tremors in the hands and fingers, persistent insomnia, violent mood swings oscillating between explosive rage and total emotional withdrawal, and a deepening, corrosive paranoia. Several historians have pointed out that Elizabeth's increasingly erratic behavior during her final years maps onto these symptoms with uncomfortable precision. Her adamant refusal to name a successor, even as her Privy Council pleaded with her, her eruptions of fury followed by days of silent brooding in darkened chambers, her inability to sleep, her growing suspicion of courtiers she had trusted for decades. The physicians treating her skin were simultaneously poisoning her nervous system, and nobody in the palace had any idea it was happening. They could not have known. The connection between mercury exposure and neurological deterioration would not be established for centuries. In the meantime, the Queen's doctors watched their patient become increasingly volatile and difficult, and they blamed her temperament, her grief over aging, the stress of ruling. They never once looked at the silvery paste they were rubbing into her face and thought that might be the problem. The cure was the disease wearing a different hat, and it kept getting reapplied on schedule. The bloodletting. Tudor medicine operated on a theory of the human body that had not meaningfully changed since the ancient Greeks codified it over 1,000 years earlier. All illness came down to 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When a patient fell sick, it meant those humors had fallen out of balance, and the standard correction for nearly every imbalance was the same. You opened a vein and let some blood out. The procedure was simple and brutal. A barber surgeon, not a trained physician, but a man who also cut hair and pulled teeth, would tie a ligature around the upper arm to make the vein bulge, then slice it open with a lancet and let the blood drain into a bowl. The patient sat there and bled until the surgeon decided enough humor had been released. There was no measurement. There was no blood typing. There was no concept of how much a human body could safely lose. Elizabeth was bled regularly throughout her entire adult life, and the frequency increased as she aged and her constellation of health problems multiplied. The lancets used on her were cleaned about as thoroughly as you might expect from an era that had no concept of germs. They were wiped on a rag, perhaps rinsed in a bowl of water that had already been used for other instruments, and then applied to the next patient without a moment of hesitation. The same blade that had opened a tradesman's vein that morning could be opening the Queen's arm by afternoon. Each bloodletting session drained Elizabeth of energy, reduced her red blood cell count, and weakened her body's ability to mount an immune response against the dental infections, the inflamed skin, and the accumulated poisons already circulating through her organs. Each session also introduced a fresh risk of bacterial contamination from instruments that had been inside other people's veins and wounds, and the logic driving the whole system was perfectly, absurdly circular. The bloodletting left her feeling exhausted, pale, and weak. That exhaustion and pallor were then interpreted by her physicians as evidence that the humors were still imbalanced, so they bled her again and again. By the time Elizabeth entered her final decline, she was an elderly woman whose body had been systematically drained of its reserves for the better part of 4 decades, hollowed out from the inside by the very treatment that was supposed to be keeping her alive. The final weeks. In January 1603, the court relocated to Richmond Palace on the Thames for the winter. Elizabeth was 69, visibly frail, and increasingly withdrawn from even her closest attendants. She had lost her dear friend and cousin Catherine Howard, the Countess of Nottingham, just weeks earlier, and the grief appeared to accelerate a decline that had already been building for months. By February, the deterioration became impossible for anyone at court to ignore. She stopped eating, or ate so little that her ladies grew genuinely alarmed. She refused to go to bed, insisting instead on sitting on cushions piled on the floor of her privy chamber, sometimes for days at a stretch without moving to another room. When her attendants tried to coax her up, she refused. When they brought food, she turned it away with a wave of her hand. She sat propped upright when she no longer had the strength to hold herself, one finger pressed against her lips, staring at the wall or the floor for hours on end, without uttering a word. Robert Cecil, her principal secretary and the closest thing she had left to a trusted advisor, finally knelt before her and urged her to go to bed. She told him, with a flash of the old defiance, that the word must was not to be used to princes. She also told him something far more unsettling. In what would become one of her final recorded statements, she said she knew full well what was happening to her body. She was not sick, she insisted. She simply wished to die. When she finally consented to be carried to her bed in mid-March, she did not rise again. Her physicians described her condition as a settled and unremovable melancholy, which could mean, in the language we use today, severe clinical depression, the neurological disintegration that follows decades of cumulative lead and mercury poisoning, the terminal phase of multi-organ failure, or very likely all 3 converging at once. Her throat became so inflamed and swollen that she could barely whisper and could not swallow solid food. Some kind of abscess may have formed in her tonsils, her throat, or her lungs. Nobody could diagnose what was happening to her. Her physicians tried their usual remedies, which almost certainly means they bled her again and may have applied more compounds to her swollen throat. Every tool in their arsenal was a tool that had been making her worse for decades, and in her final hours they reached for the same instruments one last time. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, knelt beside the bed and prayed continuously while she drifted in and out of consciousness. In the early morning of March 24, 1603, somewhere between 2 and 3 o'clock, Elizabeth Tudor died at Richmond Palace. Her ladies, preparing the body afterward, noted that she was still wearing the ceruse. Even in death, the white mask stayed on. The autopsy that never happened. Elizabeth had given explicit instructions before her death that her body was not to be cut open afterward. This was not unusual for English royalty. Many monarchs issued the same order, driven by some mixture of religious conviction about bodily resurrection and a deeply personal horror at the thought of being sliced apart on a table after death. But for anyone trying to reconstruct what actually killed the Queen, that order is a disaster. A proper autopsy in 1603, even by the crude standards of the time, might have revealed tumors in her throat or lungs, visible damage to her kidneys from decades of lead exposure, or signs of widespread infection from the dental abscesses that had plagued her final years. Instead, we got nothing. The embalmers who prepared her body for lying in state reported that her internal organs appeared unremarkable, but their examination was cursory at best. They were not physicians. They were not conducting an investigation. They were there to pack a royal corpse with preserving herbs and spices, wrap it in cerecloth, and make it presentable for 3 weeks of public mourning. That was the job, and they did it quickly. Her body was sealed inside a lead-lined coffin, which was then enclosed within a larger ornate wooden casket decorated with the royal arms for the funeral procession to Westminster Abbey. She lay in state at Whitehall Palace while London mourned. Thousands of people filed past. The court wore black. And during those 3 weeks of solemn ceremony, something happened that the attendants tried very hard to keep out of the public record. The lead coffin exploded. Decomposition gases, the natural byproduct of bacterial breakdown of tissue, built up inside the sealed metal casing with nowhere to escape. The pressure increased until the lid blew clean open in the middle of the night. According to an account attributed to Elizabeth Southwell, one of the Queen's attendants, the noise reportedly startled the women keeping the death watch so badly they nearly collapsed. They hammered the lid back down, resealed it as best they could, and the incident was hushed up as rapidly as possible. Nobody left a detailed record of what they saw or smelled when the coffin burst open. Nobody appears to have wanted to commit that to paper. The last Tudor monarch went to her grave at Westminster Abbey with her medical secrets still locked inside her body and a coffin that could not contain what was left. The cocktail. No single cause killed Elizabeth I, and that is what makes her death so grimly fascinating and so resistant to a clean one-line explanation. It was not the lead alone. It was not the mercury alone. It was not the teeth or the bloodletting or the sugar or the stress or the grief or the age. It was all of them, together, compounding, for 30 years. Think of it as a cocktail in which every ingredient made the others more toxic. The lead ceruse soaked through her skin into her bloodstream and accumulated in her bones and organs, never leaving, always building, damaging her kidneys and her nervous system in ways that Tudor medicine could not detect, let alone treat. The mercury sublimate, rubbed into the raw weeping sores that the lead paint itself created, added a second heavy metal to a body already saturated with the first, attacking her cognition, her sleep, and her emotional stability. The dental infections, fed by a lifelong sugar habit that had reduced her mouth to rotting stumps, pumped bacteria into a circulatory system that had already been weakened by decades of routine bloodletting. And the bloodletting itself, performed with contaminated instruments on a schedule that increased every time she showed signs of decline, drained the last reserves of strength her body had left to fight any of it. Remove any single factor from the equation, and Elizabeth almost certainly survives longer, maybe years longer. But stack them all together decade after decade, compounding inside a body that was also simply aging in an era with no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, no concept of heavy metal toxicity, and no diagnostic tools sophisticated enough to reveal what was happening beneath the surface, and you arrive at exactly what unfolded at Richmond Palace in March of 1603. A slow, compounding, systemic collapse that her own doctors accelerated with every treatment they prescribed. They genuinely believed they were saving their queen. They killed her faster. And the final bitter twist is that if they had simply done nothing, if they had put down the lancets and the mercury and the lead paste and left her body alone, she might have outlived them all. The price of the mask. Elizabeth almost certainly knew the ceruse was destroying her face, not the chemistry behind it. Nobody in the 16th century understood how lead accumulated in the body at a molecular level, but the physical evidence was right there in the mirror every single night. When her ladies carefully peeled the paint away before bed, the skin underneath was worse than it had been the night before. Rawer, thinner, more inflamed. She could see with her own eyes what the mask was doing. But the alternative was unthinkable. To appear before the court, before foreign ambassadors, before her own subjects without the white shell was to appear scarred, aged, and visibly mortal. For a queen who had held power for over 4 decades partly on the strength of the Virgin Queen mythology, The carefully constructed image of eternal youth and untouchable purity, that kind of exposure would have been a different sort of death altogether. A political one, and for a woman who had spent her entire adult life fighting to hold the throne, that was the one kind of death she would not accept. So Elizabeth made a calculation that most of us will never have to face in our own lives. She chose the slow poison over the fast one. She chose the version of dying that allowed her to keep looking like a queen until her very last morning, even though it meant that morning came years sooner than it needed to. And in the end, the thing that really killed Elizabeth I was not old age, not assassination, not plague, not any single identifiable disease. It was the accumulated price of maintaining an impossible image in a world that demanded perfection from a woman who had none left to give. The paint stayed on until the very end. The mask outlasted the woman underneath it, and somewhere beneath the pearl-white surface, the real Elizabeth, scarred and poisoned and rotting from 30 years of treatments that were supposed to save her, had been gone long before her heart stopped beating at Richmond Palace on that cold March morning. So what do you think? Knowing everything you know now about what that white paint was doing to her, would you have made the same choice? The slow death by your own hand, one coat at a time, or the political destruction of letting the world see what was really underneath? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. And if you enjoyed peeling back the layers of royal history that the textbooks prefer to leave out, hit subscribe, because the stories we cover here only get filthier from here.